The man who ended reign in an entire nation stepped out of nowhere. No genealogy, no hometown listed in the record, no origin story. He appears in the biblical text like something that had always been waiting. A single, violent line delivered to a king's face and then gone. As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. That is the whole introduction. No name for his father, no city, no warning, just the declaration and then silence. And then 3.5 years of a sky like hot iron above a dying land. We have been told this is a story about faith. It is not. It is a story about what happens when the most terrifying force in the ancient universe decides to fight a war using a human body as its weapon. Elijah did not volunteer for this. He was selected. And what was done to him, through him, and finally to him, follows a logic so cold and so total that it makes every sanitized Sunday school painting of the man look like a lie. The real story begins not with a miracle, but with a curse. And the curse was designed to kill everything. In the 9th century before the Common Era, the northern kingdom of Israel had become something new and deeply wrong. King Ahab, son of Omri, had built a palace in Samaria with walls inlaid with thousands of carved ivory panels, Phoenician style, imported from Tyre. Archaeologists have excavated those fragments. They are still there, stained, beautiful, obscene. The ivory house stood above a countryside that was cracking open with hunger, while the queen inside it imported gods. Jezebel of Tyre had not converted to Yahwism when she married Ahab. She had no interest in converting. In the Phoenician court where she was raised, a king was absolute, answerable to no covenant, no law, no tradition of inalienable inheritance. A king wanted something, he took it. A god wanted sacrifices, he received them. She brought Melkart, the Tyrian Baal, the rider of the clouds, the storm god who died and rose again every spring, into the heart of the Israelite state, and installed 450 of his priests on the public payroll. She then began systematically eliminating the prophets of Yahweh, hunting them the way you exterminate a pest before it can breed. The theocratic covenant that had defined Israel since Sinai was being quietly, efficiently hollowed out from the inside by a woman who understood exactly what she was doing. This is the landscape into which Elijah walks. Not a nation that had drifted into idolatry through laziness or ignorance, a nation whose entire judicial system, whose royal household, whose religious infrastructure had been consciously and deliberately co-opted by a foreign monarch's theology. The rot was not accidental, it was engineered. And the response, when it finally came, would be engineered to match. The drought that Elijah declared was not a punishment in the way a fine is a punishment. It was a targeted, localized act of theological assassination. In the ancient Near Eastern pantheon, Baal, specifically Melkart, the manifestation Jezebel had imported, was the deity of rain, fertility, storms. The Ugaritic texts from Ras Shamra depict him explicitly as the conqueror of Mot, the god of death and drought. His entire mythological identity was built on the claim that he controlled when the sky opened. His worshippers held an annual festival called the Egersis, the Awakening, celebrating the moment Baal defeated death and the rains returned. The spring rains were proof every single year that he was real and he was mighty. Elijah shut the sky, and Baal could not open it. 3 years, 6 months, the earth cracked and split. The wadis drained to stagnant mud, grain crops failed, livestock died in their fields, infants died. Old people died in the dust of a kingdom that had been promised abundance by a God who turned out to be silent. Every day without rain was another day the Agursis festival looked like theater, and the priests of Melkart looked like men screaming into a void. Yahweh was not merely punishing Israel. He was demonstrating something specific and devastating to the storm god's jurisdiction. You have no power here that I do not grant you. The drought is frequently described in religious literature as God's warning, his call to repentance. That framing is too comfortable. Paleoclimatic proxies recovered from alluvial deposits near the ancient site of Gabala confirm severe, persistent dry conditions throughout the late first millennium before the Common Era in the eastern Mediterranean. The ecological cascade triggered by a 3.5-year precipitation deficit in that region is not a metaphor. The wadis that fed the terraced agricultural plots of the hill country ran dry. The grain harvest failed first, then the grape harvest, then the olive pressings. Livestock herds that required pasture and water collapsed. The famine that followed killed civilians who had nothing to do with the theological decision-making of their king. Children died in the streets of Samaria, while the ivory house above them remained insulated, the royal treasury still full from a decade of Omride economic expansion and trade with Tyre. It is into this landscape, this dying, cracked, bleached landscape, that Yahweh hides his own instrument. The brook of Cherith is described as a wadi east of the Jordan River, a narrow ravine cut into the limestone by centuries of seasonal water. Yahweh commands Elijah to go there, to hide, and to wait. And then Yahweh tells him who will feed him. The Hebrew word used is oramim. It has been translated in almost every version of the Bible as ravens. Clean, literary, almost poetic. Black birds bringing bread in the morning and meat at dusk to the hidden prophet in the wilderness. The clinical reality is considerably darker. Oraim is a category of corvids and scavenger birds that encompasses not just the common raven, but the griffin vulture, a creature with a wingspan approaching 10 feet, a bald head engineered for submerging into the body cavities of large dead animals, and feeding habits centered entirely on the decomposing flesh of carrion. The Levitical law classified these birds as ritually unclean, as omens of desolation, markers of divine judgment on a destroyed landscape. They were the birds that circled over battlefields after the killing was done. Elijah is crouched in a rapidly drying ravine. The heat is white and absolute, the kind that vibrates at the edge of vision and makes the limestone walls of the wadi look like they are exhaling. There is no shade worth calling shade. The water in the brook is dropping day by day toward a reddish, silted mud that smells of decay, and at dawn and at dusk, there is the sound. The hard, guttural croaking that corvids make when they are agitated, the heavy concussion of massive wings folding overhead, and then the wet, dense thud of torn flesh dropped from a height onto the cracked earth in front of him. The meat was not cooked. It was not fresh. It was the torn remnant of animals that had died in the surrounding famine, scavenged from carcasses and transported in the beaks of creatures that lived by consuming death. By consuming it, Elijah was rendered ritually impure by the very law he had devoted his life to serving. He was a prophet of Yahweh eating the scraps of scavengers in a ditch, watching the water level drop below his feet, sustained by the mechanism of death itself. The word Cherith comes from a root that means to cut away. That is not coincidence. That is the text telling you something about what this place did to the man. By the time the brook finally dries completely and Yahweh sends him on, whatever softness remained in Elijah has been removed. He has been sitting among bones and black feathers and the guano of massive birds for months, eating what would make most people retch, watching a nation die outside his hiding place. He is not peaceful. He is not serene. He is stripped down to something that can function in conditions that would destroy ordinary people. That stripping down was the point. Because what is coming next requires a man with nothing left to lose. The widow of Zarephath is a detail the narrative inserts almost without fanfare, but it carries an enormous weight if you know where Zarephath is. Zarephath is a Phoenician city. It is in Sidon. It is, in other words, in Jezebel's homeland, in the territory of the very culture that has been systematically destroying the covenant Elijah serves. Yahweh does not send his prophet to a faithful Israelite household to be kept safe. He sends him to the territory of the enemy's God, to a foreign widow who is, by her own testimony, preparing the last meal she and her son will eat before they starve to death. The jar of flour that does not empty, the jug of oil that does not run dry, this miracle takes place inside Baal's claimed jurisdiction, in Baal's own backyard, and Baal cannot stop it. Every element of Elijah's hidden years is a calculated insult to Melkart. The drought that binds him, the unclean birds that sustain the prophet, the miracle that keeps a Phoenician widow alive inside Phoenicia itself. The map of the conflict is not political, it is ontological, and it has been building for 3.5 years when Yahweh finally tells Elijah to go back and present himself to Ahab, to end the hiding, to come back into the open. The confrontation that is about to happen on Mount Carmel is not a negotiation. It is a public execution, and one side already knows it. Here is something the Sunday school version of this story never tells you. By the time Elijah climbed Mount Carmel to face 450 priests of Baal, every single one of them was already bleeding. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. They had been cutting themselves with swords and spears for hours by the time Elijah opened his mouth to mock them. The Hebrew verb is wayit godadu, from the root meaning to gash, to slash, to tear open. It describes the specific, sustained ritual practice of the Phoenician Baal cult during moments of extreme crisis. And a 3.5-year drought, a drought that had proven their God unable to generate a single drop of rain, was the most extreme crisis their theology had ever faced. They were not performing a casual ceremony. They were performing emergency surgery on a dying God. The logic of what they were doing is precise once you understand the Melkart mythology. Baal's identity was built on an annual cycle of death and resurrection. Every winter he descended into the underworld, swallowed by Mot, the deity of death and drought. The spring rains were the sign that he had defeated Mot again, that he had risen, that the cycle held. When the rains stopped, not for a season, but for 42 months, the theological conclusion inside the Baal system was terrifying. Baal had not woken up. Mot still had him. He was still in the underworld, or weakened, or sleeping, or bound. The Agursis festival, the awakening, the entire liturgical mechanism for pulling him back, had failed. And so the priests were doing what the theology demanded in extremis. They were giving their own blood, their own vital life force, pouring it onto the altar to energize the dormant God, to give him enough of their essence to fight his way back to the surface. They danced around the altar from morning until midday. They screamed. The sound would have been extraordinary, a kind of human noise that has no modern equivalent. 450 trained priests of a highly organized cult in full ritual performance, voices raw, bodies slick with their own blood drying brown in the afternoon heat, the smell of old blood and fresh copper mixing with the dust and the limestone of the mountain. And then Elijah spoke. The mockery recorded in 1 Kings is surgically precise. Perhaps he is deep in thought. Perhaps he is busy or traveling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened. He is not being generically cruel. He is attacking the specific doctrinal claims of the Agursis theology. He is saying, in theological terms, Your resurrection festival isn't working. Your God is either indifferent, absent, or still dead. Call him louder. Maybe he can't hear you yet. The priests heard exactly what he was saying and doubled down, screaming harder, cutting deeper, until the blood was not trickling, but gushing, running down their arms and dripping from their hands onto the dust of the altar. And still the sky above them was empty and blue and entirely indifferent. Then Elijah called the crowd toward him. He repaired the ruined altar of Yahweh, 12 stones, one for each of the 12 tribes, and he dug a trench around it. And then he ordered something that, in the context of a 3.5-year drought, was either madness or the most deliberate provocation imaginable. He asked them to fill 4 large jars with water and pour them over the sacrifice and the wood. And then he asked them to do it again, and then a 3rd time. 12 jars of water, the most precious substance in a dying land, soaking the wood, the sacrifice, running into the trench until it was full, wetting the stones of the altar themselves. The crowd watching this was not composed of the spiritually curious. These were people who had watched their children go hungry for 3.5 years. Some of them had buried those children. Every jar of water that hit the altar was a jar that could not be drunk. They were watching either the most magnificent act of faith they had ever witnessed, or the most elaborate suicide they had ever seen. And they did not know which until the fire fell. The biblical text says it consumed the burnt offering, the wood, the stones, and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. To understand what that sentence describes, you have to step completely outside the physics of any ordinary fire. Sandstone, the most common stone in the Levantine Hill Country, melts at approximately 1,300 degrees Celsius, a temperature equivalent to modern industrial blast furnaces that require hours of sustained heat to liquefy rock. For stone to be incinerated, not melted but consumed, and for standing water to be instantaneously vaporized from a trench, the localized temperature in that moment would need to approach conditions found in plasma. A massive lightning strike reaches temperatures approaching 30,000 degrees Celsius, roughly 5 times the surface temperature of the sun. The water-soaked, elevated stone altar, after years of severe drought building enormous static charge in the atmosphere, functioned as a perfect conductive lightning rod. But a lightning strike is measured in microseconds. What the text describes is sustained, targeted, total. The ash fell. The trench where the water had been was dry. The stones were gone. The crowd fell on their faces in the dust. They barely had time to register what they had seen before Elijah was speaking again, and his voice had changed. The mockery was gone. What replaced it was the flat, implacable register of a man issuing an operational order. Take the prophets of Baal. Let not one of them escape. 450 men. Already weak from blood loss, from hours of extreme physical and psychological exertion, from the specific shock of watching their God fail so completely and publicly. Some of them had fainted. Some were barely standing. None of them were armed in any way that mattered now, because the crowd that seized them was a crowd that had watched 3.5 years of famine end in a single moment. And they had waited, and they were angry. They drove the priests down the steep slopes of Mount Carmel to the Wadi Kishon. The descent alone is brutal. The mountain drops sharply toward the valley, the limestone scree treacherous, the men stumbling and falling and being dragged upright. The Kishon River at the base of the valley is not a dramatic, roaring waterway. It is a sluggish, swampy stream that drains the Jezreel Valley toward the Mediterranean. It smells of silt and standing water and the rot of things caught in the reed beds. This is where Elijah killed 450 men. The record does not tell us exactly how. It says he slaughtered them there. The practical mechanics of what that sentence contains are almost impossible to fully hold in the mind. Even with the crowd participating, even with the priests too weakened and shocked to mount any real resistance, the sheer physical labor of ending that many lives is something that breaks through into the body. The sound of it, the smell of voided bowels and arterial blood hitting the water and the mud, the screaming, the way a man's arms tremble after the first dozen, and the way they keep going, because they have to keep going, because this is what was commanded, and the fire on the mountain is still smoking above them. Elijah did not descend from Carmel in triumph. He descended covered in the physical evidence of what he had done. His hands shook. His arms ached to the bone. The adrenaline of the confrontation, the miracle, the crowd's fervor, was metabolizing into something else, something heavier and quieter, and much more difficult to carry. He had stood on that mountain as the instrument of the divine, radiant with certainty, calling fire from a cloudless sky. He had ended the afternoon in a swamp, wading through the blood of 450 men. He did not yet know what Jezebel would say when she heard, but he was about to. The rain came that night. Elijah outran Ahab's chariot to Jezreel in the first downpour. The drought was over. The battle was won. The fire had fallen. The prophets were dead. By every measurable theological metric, Elijah had succeeded completely, and none of it was enough. When Jezebel's messenger found him, Elijah was still standing. He had just orchestrated the most dramatic single-day theological confrontation in the recorded history of the ancient Levant. He had personally executed 450 armed priests. He had called supernatural fire down from a sky that hadn't produced rain in 3.5 years. He had physically outrun a war chariot in a rainstorm. By any rational assessment, he was untouchable. Jezebel's message was 12 words. "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." He ran. Not strategically, not with a plan. He fled south with his servant, all the way to Beersheba, the absolute southernmost edge of the inhabited world as he knew it, and then he left even his servant there and walked alone into the Negev wilderness. He walked until his legs stopped being able to carry him with any purpose, and he found a broom tree, a sparse desert shrub that offered almost no shade, and he sat down underneath it and asked God to let him die. Every clinical marker of what modern psychology identifies as acute post-traumatic stress disorder is present in the text of 1 Kings 19. The sudden, catastrophic terror response after sustained hyperarousal, the flight mechanism overwhelming the fight response, the isolation, the intentional removal from all human contact, the dissociation from the accomplishments that should logically provide security, the suicidal ideation, the sleep that falls over him immediately and completely, the sleep of total nervous system collapse rather than rest. He had been operating in a state of continuous, severe physiological crisis for over 3 years. The drought, the hiding, the Cherith Wadi, the widow's household, the confrontation, the fire, the slaughter. The human nervous system is simply not engineered to sustain that load indefinitely, and it doesn't matter how certain you are of your calling or how recently you watched fire fall from heaven. The body will eventually collect what it is owed. What broke him was not Jezebel's threat specifically. Her threat was, by itself, not more dangerous than what he had already survived. What broke him was the realization that followed the threat. Nothing had changed. The prophets were dead, and the queen was still queen. The fire had fallen, and the ivory house was still standing. The rain had returned, and Ahab was still on the throne. He had given everything. 3.5 years of isolation and ritual impurity and physical degradation, and the blood of 450 men on his hands. And the system he had been deployed against was still operational. The murder of Naboth had happened before the slaughter at Carmel, not after. The judiciary had already been co-opted. The land had already been stolen through fabricated testimony and the weaponized legal system. Elijah was the most powerful prophet in Israel's history, and he had changed nothing that mattered at the structural level. He said it himself, sitting under the broom tree in the Negev heat. "It is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." The phrase, "no better than my fathers," is not false modesty. It is the specific grief of a man who believed he had been chosen to do something no one had managed before, and who now concluded that the attempt had failed. He had been special. He had been certain. And certainty, when it collapses, falls harder than ordinary doubt ever could. The divine response to this moment is one of the most clinically striking things in the entire text. There is no rebuke, no thunder, no voice demanding he get back up and complete his commission. There is an angelic presence that touches him gently and tells him to eat. Beside his head there is bread baked on hot coals and a jar of water. He eats, he drinks. He lies down again and falls immediately back into the unconsciousness of complete exhaustion. The entity lets him sleep. When it wakes him a second time, it says something with its message. "Arise and eat, for the journey is too much for you." Not "get up and stop being afraid," not "remember what you have accomplished." The journey is too much for you. It is an acknowledgement of the severity of what has been carried, not a denial of it. God provides carbohydrates and rest to a prophet in psychological collapse, because the nervous system requires food and sleep before it can receive anything else, and the text seems to understand this. He gets up, he eats again, and then he walks 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Horeb. Horeb is Sinai. It is the geographic and theological foundation of everything, the mountain where Yahweh descended in fire and smoke and earthquake, and the Israelites could not look at it without dying. The mountain where the covenant was given, the mountain where Moses stood and the rock split and the water poured out. Elijah is walking back to the origin point of everything he has served, and when he gets there, he goes into a cave and shelters in the dark. There is something quietly devastating about that detail. The most powerful prophet in the nation's history is crouching in a hole in the mountain where the covenant was born, hiding from a woman. He is not meditating. He is not praying. He is in the dark because the dark feels marginally safer than the open air. Yahweh speaks to him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" It is not an accusation, it is a question, and Elijah answers it with complete honesty. He is the only one left who is faithful, and they are trying to kill him, and he wants to know why he should continue. He says it twice, before and after the theophany, as if the experience between those two recitations changes nothing in his assessment of the situation. It is the most human moment in his entire narrative. Then the wind comes. The text says it is a great and strong wind, one that tears mountains and shatters rocks. In the Levant, the sirocco, the khamsin, can drop visibility to 0 and heat the air to temperatures that feel like standing in an oven. The limestone rocks of Sinai shatter audibly in the thermal stress of such storms, a sound like distant rifle fire. Elijah crouches in the cave, and the mountain is being dismantled outside him. But the Lord was not in the wind. Then the earthquake. The Sinai Peninsula sits on a complex of tectonic fault lines. Earthquakes there are not abstractions. They are the ground becoming suddenly and completely unreliable. the bedrock of reality opening into nothing. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. Then the fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. What came after the fire was Kol Damama Daka. The King James Bible translated this as a still small voice, and that translation has shaped 3.5 centuries of theology about a gentle God whispering to the human heart. The actual Hebrew is harder and stranger, and considerably more frightening. The literal reading is a sound of sheer silence, a voice of crushing silence. The presence of the divine communicated not through audible signal, but through the absolute, overwhelming, total absence of any sound whatsoever. Think about what that means as a physical experience. The mountain had just been torn by wind and cracked by earthquake and scorched by fire. The acoustic aftermath of those forces, the resonance, the settling, the ambient noise of a landscape in shock, and then something cuts through all of it. Not a voice, an absence. A silence so complete and so weighted that it is more present than the earthquake was, more penetrating than the fire, more absolute than the storm. At Carmel, the 450 priests of Baal had screamed and bled and danced for hours, and their God had met them with the silence of failure and absence. At Horeb, Yahweh meets Elijah with the silence of total, crushing, inescapable presence. The irony is so precise it seems designed, which, the text implies, it was. Elijah wraps his face in his mantle and moves to the mouth of the cave. He cannot look at it. He cannot stand exposed before it. The same man who stood in front of Ahab, who called fire from the sky, who executed the servants of a rival god, cannot stand upright before the silence. He covers his face and crouches at the edge of the void and waits. The question comes again, the same question as before. What are you doing here, Elijah? And he gives the same answer, word for word, as if to say, I heard everything. I felt all of it. And I still don't know why I should continue. This is not a failure of faith. It is an entirely honest response to a genuine problem. The great miracle of Carmel happened, and the political structure of Israel was unchanged. He is saying this to the same divine force that engineered the miracle and is asking the question. He is not lying. He is reporting. And the answer he receives is not theological, it is operational. There are 3 things left to do: anoint a new king over Syria, anoint a new king over Israel, and appoint Elisha as his own successor. The commission is not revoked, it is redistributed. And in the redistribution is the quiet acknowledgement of something Elijah had not considered. He says he is the only one left. Yahweh tells him there are 7,000 in Israel who have not bowed to Baal. He has been alone for so long, hidden in so many dark places, that he had genuinely lost count of the faithful. He thought he was the last. He was wrong by 7,000. This does not immediately fix the brokenness, but it changes its shape. There is a moment near the end of Elijah's story that every artist who has ever tried to paint it has gotten wrong. You have seen the images: a golden chariot pulled by white horses, bathed in warm celestial light, a serene old prophet stepping aboard while his devoted student watches from below with upturned, wondering eyes. It is the visual language of comfortable ascension, of a life completed and a soul at rest. The text describes something entirely different. It describes a catastrophe. Elijah and Elisha are walking together near the Jordan River. The prophetic community, the sons of the prophets at Bethel and Jericho, already know what is coming that day. They have told Elisha twice that Yahweh is about to take his master away. Elisha has told them twice to be quiet. He knows. He does not want to speak about it. The knowing sits between them as they walk, heavy and unacknowledged, the way grief sits before it is permitted to be grief. They cross the Jordan by the most violent pastoral miracle in the text. Elijah takes his mantle, rolls it, strikes the water, and the river parts. They cross on dry ground. Every element of that crossing is borrowed from the theological vocabulary of Moses, of Joshua. The Jordan has been parted before, at the founding of the nation. Elijah is closing a loop that began at Sinai, and both men know it. On the other side, Elijah asks Elisha what he wants. Elisha asks for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. It is an enormous request. The double portion was what the firstborn son received, the claim of the primary heir. Elijah says this, "If you see me when I am taken, the request is granted. If not, it will not be." He is telling Elisha to watch, to not look away, to witness what is about to happen to him, because what is about to happen to him will be very difficult to watch. Then it comes. The Hebrew text calls it Rechev Esh, chariots of fire, and Susei Esh, horses of fire. Those who have attempted to understand these terms through the lens of early Jewish Merkabah mysticism, the tradition of the divine chariot that runs from Ezekiel through the Hechalot literature, describe the Merkabah not as a vehicle in any conventional sense, but as something closer to a localized rupture in the geometry of the physical world. The Ophanim, the wheel forms described in these traditions, are covered in eyes, spinning inside each other in counter-rotating fields of light, emitting a sound and a radiance that no human language was designed to contain. The intrusion of such a construct into the physical plane would not resemble a landing. It would resemble a tear. The Merkabah appears between the two men and separates them violently. The text is precise about this. It separated the two of them. This is not a gentle partitioning. This is a shock wave of force and light and dimensional intrusion that drives Elisha backward and creates a boundary between the two prophets that Elisha cannot cross. The air between them is no longer air. It is something else entirely, something that hums at a frequency below sound and radiates light that is not warm but white and absolute and wrong in the way that ancient things are wrong when they intrude on the modern world. And then the whirlwind takes Elijah up. The Hebrew word is sa'ara. It means a violent, destructive storm wind, not a gentle updraft, a tempest. The kind of wind that appears in the text earlier when Elijah was on Horeb, the wind that tore mountains and shattered rocks, and in which the Lord deliberately was not present. The same class of wind, and this time it is the mechanism of extraction. Human biology is not designed to survive the proximity of the raw divine state. The prophetic tradition that wrestles with Elijah's ascension, the esoteric traditions that attempt to describe what happens when a mortal is drawn fully into contact with the unearthly, arrives consistently at the same conclusion. The physical body cannot make the transition intact. What the Sa'ara pulls upward is not a man in a cloak. It is the disintegration and reassembly of a human being in a form that the physical world can no longer contain or describe. The prophet is shattered into light. The vessel that carried 3.5 years of drought and exile and slaughter and despair and divine silence is unmade in a moment, and whatever emerges from that unmaking is no longer something that has a name in any human language. What falls back to earth is the mantle, the heavy, rough sheepskin cloak that Elijah had worn through the wadis and the wilderness and the blood of the Kishon River. It drifts down from the fire and the vortex in the specific, unhurried way that a heavy garment falls when it is no longer being worn, and it hits the scorched earth with a sound that Elisha can hear. Elisha tears his own clothes in two. The gesture in the ancient Near Eastern tradition is the somatic language of grief so severe that the body has to express it physically, has to manifest the interior rupture in the exterior world. He is alone now. He is on the wrong side of the Jordan from the prophetic community. He is holding a dirty sheepskin cloak and looking at a sky that is already becoming ordinary again, and the weight of what he has just witnessed and what he has just inherited settles onto his shoulders like stone. He picks up the mantle. He walks back to the Jordan. He strikes the water with it and says, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" The water parts. He crosses. The sons of the prophets who had been watching from Jericho fall to the ground before him and say, "The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha." The thing that Elijah carried has been transferred. Not his personality, not his history, not the specific horrors he survived and inflicted, but the office, the commission, the terrible, precise weight of being the instrument of a terrifying God in a world that does not want to hear what he has to say. Elisha will go on to perform more miracles by count than Elijah did. He will heal and multiply and raise the dead. He will be softer than his master in some respects, harder in others. He will never have a Carmel, a moment of singular, operatic, theological violence on a mountaintop. But he will carry the mantle into a different era, and the ministry that began when a man stepped out of nowhere and told a king it would not rain will continue for another generation, reshaping the political landscape of the ancient Near East. And Elijah, the original, the instrument, the shattered and reassembled vessel, does not end. The final chapter of the Hebrew Bible ends with the words that a figure called Elijah will return before the great and terrible day of the Lord, to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the children to the fathers, or else the land will be struck with a curse. He disappears upward in fire and is immediately prophesied to return. He is the only figure in the Hebrew Bible for whom the tradition built an empty chair at the Passover table, because the tradition genuinely was not sure he was gone, and was genuinely not sure when he would come back, and genuinely did not want to be found unprepared. The chair sits empty at the table every year. The door is opened at the appointed moment, and the question the ritual embeds in every household that performs it is the same question the narrative refused to fully answer. What do you do when someone who is broken beyond recovery by the weight of the divine still has work left to do? Now here is the irony that changes everything you just heard. Elijah's greatest strength was his uncompromising, absolute certainty. The certainty that shut the sky. The certainty that called the fire. The certainty that drove him down to the Kishon River and waded through what he waded through without flinching, because he was certain it was required. That same certainty, identical, indistinguishable, is what collapsed him under the broom tree in the Negev desert. The same architecture that made him the most effective instrument of the divine in a generation was the architecture that broke when Jezebel's 12 words hit it. He was not broken despite his faith. He was broken because of it. The thing that made him extraordinary was the thing that made him fragile. Which means the story you just heard is not actually about an ancient prophet at all. It is about every person who has ever committed so completely to something they believed in that when it didn't work, when the fire fell and the system survived anyway, they had nothing left to fall back on. The specific loneliness of having given everything and discovered that everything was not enough. You know this feeling. You have sat under your own version of the broom tree. You have asked your own version of the question, what was the point, and am I the only one left who tried? 7,000. The answer was 7,000, and he couldn't see any of them from where he was hiding. Here is the question that will keep you up tonight. Elijah executed 450 men by the Kishon River. He was commanded to do it, and the fire of God had just fallen from the sky in response to his prayer, and the crowd that helped him do it believed they had witnessed the definitive proof of divine sanction. Was that enough? Is "I was commanded" and "the proof was unmistakable" sufficient justification for the Kishon? Or does the method of the proof change what the proof proves? And be careful before you answer, because the thing you believe about Elijah in that moment is the same thing you believe about every person in history who has ever committed an atrocity in the name of a certainty they could not be argued out of. The fire fell. They saw it. So did he. There is a thread in this story that was never resolved, a figure who disappeared without explanation and has been waiting, by the tradition's own reckoning, ever since. The mantle that Elisha picked up off the scorched earth is the physical record of a man who was taken before his work was complete. And if the prophecy at the end of Malachi means what it says, then the story that began when a nameless man stepped out of nowhere and declared war on a storm god is not finished. It is only paused. The chair at the table is still empty. The door is still opened every year, and whoever is on the other side of it has not yet walked through. What happens when he does is a story you have already been pulled into without realizing it.